Here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, there is, set to take place one of these big sporting events that largely is intended to sort of launder the reputation of Israel at a moment where really, the quote unquote brand of this nation has never been more embattled, you could say. And yet, as a group of authors wrote in Mondoweiss, at just about the same moment in mid-September that others were further contemplating sanctions and a growing number of nations were recognizing Palestinian sovereignty, Canada, and in particular Nova Scotia, Halifax, where I am, will host Israel in a tie of the Davis Cup International Tennis Tournament. In your piece on Israeli sports washing, you identify this double standard when it comes to, recognizing what's happening. Israel's just not seen really as doing it, despite the fact that they have this official policy of propaganda known as Hasbara, that includes the manipulation of sport for the purpose of like national branding. Thinking back to the piece you wrote, which is about how, the cycling world in some ways is so perfect for the use of this sort of reputation laundering. To what extent do you sort of think that sports washing is about kind of preying on people's lack of political literacy? And to what extent do you think it's more about kind of like tapping into these assumptions about the neutrality and purity and meritocratic nature of sport? Like where do you sort of lean in terms of how you think now about the way sport is like manipulated for this political use?
Yeah, and I would add escapism to your list of qualities. Uh, it is, I think, one of the tools that makes sport such a devastatingly effective deliverer of soft power, that it is for many of us the place where people go to escape from real world problems. Uh, that it is a place where we go to find joy and belonging and community and uh, it's a celebration of the human body. It's the celebration of team spirit and all of these things. And these are I guess the emotions and the impulses that make it so easily hijacked. We are not expecting to be assailed by political messages in this space. International sport in particular, and it's always struck me as something quite absurd when people say, let's try and keep politics out of sport. Let's try and keep sport in a political space. Politics should have no place here. These are teams that are literally competing for in the name of a state under a flag for a national anthem. Uh, the national team is by its very definition a political construct, and different states have different relationships with their sporting teams. But I think certainly in the case of Israel, if you look at Sylvan Adams, who's the principal of the owner of Israel Premier Tech, the cycling team, he's been very clear about this fact that about his intention that he sees himself as a sporting ambassador for the state of Israel. The other part of it is you do get national sporting teams these days that almost try and separate themselves from the state that they represent, or try and brand themselves in a way that almost supersedes the polity of whatever country they happen to represent. You look at the All Blacks New Zealand rugby union team, and you wouldn't think of the New Zealand government. They have very successfully carved themselves out of space where they're almost kind of a global brand that supersedes New Zealand itself. People celebrated Argentina winning the men's 2022 Football World Cup, but they didn't see it as a triumph for the Argentinian government. And partly I guess that is a political ignorance, but also it's because Argentina isn't actively trying to bulldoze its way through world affairs. It's not trying to, erase another people. It is not dropping bombs on its neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it is of course like a different of intensity, but then there's this other thing that you seem to be naming, pointing to, which is this, as I call it, kind of double standard, which numerous people have pointed out in the wake of October 7th, 2023, and the the genocidal campaign of destruction since. that Israel seems to be exempt in certain ways, protected, perhaps shielded by the United States in ways that Russia is not, Saudi Arabia is not per se. And so the thing that you say Israeli sporting diplomacy achieves and can achieve because of this context is that when you hear the country's name, you won't think of any of this. You won't think about military checkpoints or the bombing of Gaza or the Palestinian occupation or really Palestinians at all, right? We're at a point, though, I think, in the genocide where boycott, divestment, and sanctions are seen by many as maybe the most meager response to what Israel is doing. And yet, these sporting events, for the reasons that you just pointed to, continue to take place, even when it leads to, Zionists in the street chanting anti-Muslim slogans, sowing violence in other countries. So, I get the idea that states would want to use sporting diplomacy as like a spectacle to distract. What I guess I'm wondering about as like a strategy of resistance here is, what's going on within international bodies like the Tennis Federation, who are so attached clearly to, the PR value of preserving sport as like in some ways a way of cleaning up a state's crimes, but moreover, these important values that you point to, right? What's in it for them? And how do we shake things up for them? Like how do you, right? Like how do you boycott, divest an international sporting body? What are the politics of that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an increasingly pertinent question, and I think one that international sport as a whole, I can't speak with any great specificity or privileged knowledge as to what the ITF are thinking internally, but generally, sporting bodies, big and small, have pretty much been able to sidestep this whole question by virtue of one simple fact, really. Israel has not been very good at a lot of the sports it participates in. And so
Right.
this they're not trying to host a World Cup like Saudi Arabia did or Russia did in 2018. They're not trying to host an Olympics. And as much as there would almost certainly be calls for boycotts if they qualified for a football World Cup. Israel have never qualified for a full World Cup, so they've done a pretty good job of boycotting the tournament themselves. Um, so I think partly this explains why the I guess the strategies and the kind of the preparations that you would put in place as a governing body to try and deal with um, the fallout or the ramifications of Israel in international sport simply haven't come up because it's been on far too small a scale.
Hmm.
Uh, I know for a fact that there are lots of people in UEFA who are are terrified or pretty much terrified of the prospect of Israel qualifying for a major tournament. Uh, not because of, not necessarily because of any ideological opposition to that happening, but simply because of the ramifications of what that would be in terms of uh, the PR, the the kind of the geopolitical fallout from that, the calls for boycotts, and it's a headache that frankly most people don't want. It's a burden that they don't want to have to deal with. Uh, I think what you've definitely seen in the last, what is it, almost 2 years now, is a groundswell of opinion globally that almost outstrips any of that. So the precedent has obviously been set with Russia and its invasion of Ukraine, Russia and Belarus banned from the Olympics and quite a lot of major sporting events. People are now pointing out this double standard. People are wondering why is this same standard not being employed? And we can go sport by sport through this, but the simple fact is that ordinary people do not have a huge amount of sway over the governing bodies that look after their sports. They are
Hmm.
not transparent, they are not accountable, and they're largely resistant to public pressure. You can't vote in or vote out the executive committee of FIFA or UEFA. So the strategies for influencing these bodies are still they're quite an imprecise and often quite ineffectual form.
And yet, yeah, we're kind of stuck in this position where, in here in Halifax, the concerns, I guess, around quote unquote security, safety around the event led to spectators being banned from the event, which meant that the city, which had pledged $55,000 to support this live sporting event, effectively giving its stamp of approval to the event, could withdraw that funding without making a political statement. So it's to your point, right? These bodies, even governing, bodies like local government, they really don't want to touch the complexity and the controversy and so on, right? In the news, in the reporting around the Davis Cup, there's been a similar quietism where local businesses asked about the lack of revenue coming in from tourism, blah, 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 just will not make a comment, right? So there is still, a chilling effect that's hard to overcome that seems to actually run alongside the censoring of Palestinian solidarity broadly, right? But can you maybe speak to how you see like certain parts of the sporting world actually like kind of rising up in support of Palestinian lives? Because, you know, I mean, as they write in Mondoweiss, sport is not a triviality amid this horror. As of late June 2025, the Palestinian Football Association has recorded the deaths of 785 Palestinian athletes, right? So, like, I think there is, it feels to me at least, like there is this kind of growing sense of solidarity, even among like athletes, right?
Yeah, I think, if you look at football, to take the biggest example, the fact that so many of the world's greatest players are of the Muslim faith, for example, and are, I guess, more prepared to speak up about this. You have this was 3 or 4 years ago. You had Hamza Chowdhury, the Leicester player, holding up a Palestine flag at the FA Cup final.
Hmm.
Uh, I think Paul Pogba did it for Manchester United as well at Wembley. Then you have somebody like Mohamed Salah, who's possibly, he may well be the world's most famous Arab, and he, after I think, a certain reticence on his part has been, certainly in recent months, far more willing to speak up and use his voice. And a governing body, or a sporting administrator, they can ignore me or you, but they can't really ignore Mohamed Salah. He's he's integral to the show.
Hmm.
And this is replicated in other sports. You can't stop Olympians from having a voice, because you are literally inviting tens of thousands of athletes from all over the world. In cricket, there's lots of Muslim players in cricket. Usman Khawaja, you may be aware of Usman Khawaja, the Australian cricketer,
Hmm.
who got a lot of blowback for putting very anodyne statements on his shoes, like I think it was something like, death is bad or something, or
Yeah,
stop killing people, or
right.
it was something incredibly neutral.
Hmm.
And the authorities massively clamped down on him. I think he got fined for it. But it's the Streisand effect in many ways. You almost draw attention to the cause through sanctioning it. And what you're saying about the local effects of the security implications that in Nova Scotia. This is, I think, all forms of organized resistance have always known this, right? This is why boycotts work. This is why protests work. If you make it hard, you make the cost as high as you can
Right.
for business as usual to take place.
That's right. And I mean, like you talked about how, when people are taking in a game, they're not expecting to be like assailed by, as you put it, politics. But there are these moments where politics kind of erupts onto sport, right? And I'm always encouraged by it, right? Like it takes bravery to take a knee during the national anthem, right? And then be blacklisted for the rest of your sporting career. It takes bravery to put a fist in the air at the Olympics on the podium and shake things up that way. So, and like it takes zero courage to do politics in the way that like traditionally sporting events like the Super Bowl do politics, which is fighter jets overhead and flags everywhere. Like those are the kinds of politics that I think largely get invisibilized. So I'm just, right now I'm hyper aware of the ways in which sport is seen or maybe not seen as a terrain of political struggle, right? Whether it is or not. And I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you about was if, this question of whether to what extent, because sport is about winning, right? There's this like gospel of winning, and you talked about how in some ways that can override some of these like political concerns for whatever reason. There is something inherently inspiring about seeing the body in motion, pushing past its limits in these ways. Do you think it's really possible, though, for like sporting success to actually equal a kind of cultural amnesia about these crimes? And what does it say about us? That
Oh,
that,
totally. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. You take the Olympics, for example, and which has in many cases become a huge nationalistic pageant. We have the cult of Team GB over here. I'm sure you have it, you had it there with the Winter Olympics in particular. Um, but there are alternative ways of reading it, right? One of the things I love about the Olympics is that it teaches you that greatness comes from everywhere, that great sporting bodies come in every form, and and that there are no national borders on talent. Uh, but in terms of sport as a political space, I think the it's becoming increasingly hard for anyone to maintain or even want to maintain the fiction that sport can be separate from politics. I think social media has a huge impact on this. The fact that we are now because the way that people consume sport is not just in a stadium, it's not just passively through a television. We are also second screening it. We are scrolling through social media at the same time. That's how we're consuming our sport. And the fact that we now have these kind of personalized feeds where sport and politics and culture and everything is kind of meshed together
mm,
has almost broken down that firewall a little bit. The fact that we all know that there's a World Cup going to Saudi Arabia and that Qatar has been buying Paris Saint-Germain and just won the Champions League. The fact that the World Cup has gone to Russia and it went to Qatar and it's going to go to Saudi Arabia. We I think are becoming more cognizant as a population of the forces behind this, because it is adulterating the game. Politics, global politics is shaping the games that we love in ways that are increasingly hard to resile from or be ignorant of.
yeah,
So I think that is I think a cause for maybe cautious optimism. The fact that it maybe that difficult conversations are being had and sometimes toxic and rancorous conversations are being had. But for example, two of our main football presenters in this country, Gary Lineker, who you might know as an ex-footballer, one of the main broadcasters on football in this country. He's been ever since Brexit, basically, he's been tweeting very and speaking out very courageously, I think, about things like Gaza, about things like the treatment of refugees.
right.
Ended up kind of paying for it with his job almost. And then on the other side of it, you have
People do.
yeah, right, you have Laura Woods, who is one of the main presenters of sport on ITV and Sky, and she's tweeting this morning about Charlie Kirk and what a shame it is that he got shot. And that's I kind of unthinkable. It's almost unthinkable that you would have this kind of uh, this melding of sport and politics and these voices and these issues all kind of brushing up against each other in the same space. And I don't know where it leads. I don't know what the ramifications of it are, but it is becoming a much more of a mixed use space, if that makes any
Mhm.
sense.
No, and I mean, I'm a huge fan of basketball, and basketball is, the NBA has become an increasingly political league. I mean, there are still issues, of course, around its complicity in certain spaces, but I mean, ultimately, there seems to have emerged this kind of, a comfort with politics, which is new, right? Like
Right.
one of the
And the
things we
WN
say,
the WNBA, the
yeah,
WNBA is like overtly political, right? It runs voter drives
overtly
and things like
political.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. fearlessly so, right? And that, yeah, I think that is a source for some cautious optimism. Some sports, are far more resistant to politicization, but we've seen with the aforementioned Colin Kaepernick struggle, how that can sometimes mean that that's the biggest lever, right? Is going to those sports where it's like there's something either brutish and basically violent about the Darwinist spectacle you're watching. I see football as kind of that, or the kind of dignified civility of like so many of these sports, like golf or whatever. Like to go into those spaces and say, this is already whitewashed, and now we're actually seeing another level of polish to that whitewash where, there's actual, crimes, authoritarian crimes, and, basically fascism being cloaked by this sport. And yeah, I mean, I just feel like Pandora's box has sort of been open, and it's not easy to go back to a time before. In part, I think, as you say, because of the ways that social media has really given a platform to people that, in Laura Ingram's words, according to some, should shut up and dribble, right? That was her famous line
Yeah,
about LeBron James and Kevin Durant saying stuff about Trump, just shut up and dribble. Well, what do? They create a documentary series called Shut Up and Dribble, where they just go and talk politics, right? And that can be a sort of political education for folks. Anyway, now I'm rambling. I apologize. But I think that's sort of where we're at here in Halifax, is people are having a little bit of a political education because a struggle that is easy for a lot of people to displace and say it is a holy war in the Middle East. Like that's the line you sometimes see, which is like the most othering way you could ever depict the war on Gaza, right? People that are used to seeing that frame are instead seeing it as a local struggle, right? A struggle over, our complicity in genocide. And I think that matters.
I think so too. Um, yeah, I mean, I find it really interesting because it is everywhere. It is everywhere you look. And as someone, as a member of the media, I feel a kind of a duty and a responsibility. Yeah, not to educate. I think that feels a bit like eating your greens. But there are really interesting ways in which political forces have always shaped sport itself that are not easy to miss. In fact, the West Indies cricket team, right? You may be, I don't know how into cricket you are, but the West Indies has always produced amazing fast bowlers. It's been known for producing fast bowlers right from the 30s when it first started playing international cricket, through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. The West Indies had it, and that is the result of politics. It's because when the Caribbean colonies were slave colonies, the masters would bat because batting was seen as a gentlemanly thing to do, and
Mm.
the labourers in the field would, well, go and take a ball and run fast and bowl it fast. And that division of labour has persisted in cricket pretty much through its first 100 years. The middle class and the landed gentry would be the batters or the batsmen, as they once called them, and the working class and the labourers the labouring classes would form the fast bowlers. And you still kind of see that today. In England, fast bowlers tend to come from the northeast, and all the batters seem to come from, public schools and
Wow.
in Somerset and Yorkshire and Surrey.
That's wild. I didn't realize that. And I wonder how that kind of grafts onto baseball, like the extolling of the ace as the thing that one needs to have. Anyway, we could talk on and on about all these different spaces and this kind of evolving political consciousness. But I love your point that it's less about education, actually, than something way more participatory and even euphoric when it comes to like the ways in which we get pulled into sport and begin to like passionately identify. Like that's one of the real powers of it, I think. Anyway, yeah, thanks so much for your time, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your insight.
Yeah, well, have me back next time the a international pariah state visits Nova Scotia.
So yeah, please do come back. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
I wanted to talk to you, of course, about the article you wrote for The Breach in mid-August. Israel is trying to sports wash its genocide with Canada as host. Because this global struggle for Palestinian liberation has sort of been brought home for Nova Scotians in certain ways, it's no longer as easy to sort of imagine that it's just across the ocean. We don't have to worry about it, which is I think unfortunately a kind of quietist, convenient position that a lot of folks in like mainstream Canada occupy. So you write in the article, that sports at their best bring people together, inspiring lofty ideals like pride and inclusion and patriotism. But there's like a dark side to how that power can be used in certain ways. Why did you ask in your article, are Palestinian lives not equally valuable and deserving of solidarity? What values do professional sports promote in our communities when Israel can announce, the annexation of Gaza and admit to assassinating journalists and then still have its athletes welcome into our city with open arms? I thought we could start there.
Yeah, I mean, if we actually look at the history of sports itself, there's always been this tension. So people say sports is not political, sports is beyond politics. This is one of the arguments that's being launched, that you're somehow introducing politics into sports. But if you look at the very ideologies that make up the development of professional sports and then sports as an institution, they're heavily underlain by classism, racism, etc. So, the starting with the upper classes used to engage in sport as in like the skills that you needed to be an officer in the military. So like hunting, riding, and team sports was working class. So things like, football. And the upper classes always feared the riotous pleasures of, those kind of sports, specifically because they thought the working class got riled up, like whether through boxing matches or through team sports. And so for a long time, sports was not considered, respectable pastime. And then as we move into the British public school system, so as the upper classes stop being educated at home and start being educated in these public schools, specifically at rugby, sporting becomes part of this upper class curriculum, right? And they start to see it as molding men for empire. And it's a misquote, but that famous quote, I believe it's from the Duke of Wellington, is, the empire was won on the playing fields of Eden and Harrow, which is like a misquote. But, that's the idea, right? That then you move from the idea that sports is this riotous working class activity to sports can train upper class boys in these values of character and morality and leadership that they then use to go out into the colony, and they'll go out and dominate empire and rule over empire, right? So sports has this shift. So there's inherently a classist shift at the notion of professional sports. And, we still attach to these ideas of morality, who plays sports the right way, who's cocky versus who's a leader on the field. And those are also inherently racial narratives, right? So obviously, for a long time, the NFL like banned dancing celebrations, which my sister used to call too much blackness on the field, right? So there's often a attempt to repress Black bodies when they participate in sports and elevate, white sporting bodies as the moral, correct, and character-filled bodies. They're so humble, they're a true leader, they're the coach on the field, like these kind of narratives. The Olympics itself is part of, the muscular Christianity movement, which was the idea that particularly in response to the British getting their ass kicked basically by like the Sioux and in South Africa by the Boer. So they encountered in colonial battle, they would take these losses and put it down to this crisis in masculinity, right? That the more that we get over civilized, that's good. Like we're white and we're civilized, so that's great. Like we have to dominate the uncivilized people of the earth, the primitive people. We are mind and they are body. But the flip side of that becomes this nostalgia for the primitive. And you say, oh, they're so good at being men and we've become weak, decrepit, overly urbanized men. And so there's this desire towards masculinity. And that becomes part of this muscular Christianity. The white man, will go out and through sports show the domination, natural domination over the brown and Black peoples of the earth. And that is the ideology underlying the Olympics, right? So I say all of that to say that we cannot separate our modern conception of sports from these like inherently racist and classist narratives. So the pretense that sports exists outside of that, when we play the national anthem at matches, even if they're not international matches, so before hockey games involving two Canadian teams, when there's frequently things like military flyovers or honoring cops. So sports has always allied itself in the current narrative to power. So it's not politics if you hold, a minute silence for 9/11 during the seventh inning stretch, or sing God Bless America, as they used to do for many years. It's not introducing politics to sports if you have veteran of the game or a military flyover or a military parade, but it is introducing politics if you want to kneel for the national anthem or talk about anti-war or boycott Israel from international sports. So what we see is the politics of sports always leans towards authoritarian, the status quo, power, and conservatism, and any challenge to that is labeled as beyond sports. So this is incredibly, obviously important in terms of this Davis Cup match, because we've seen, on the one hand, these sporting bodies, when it comes to Russia, immediately condemn Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, immediately ban Russian athletes. So athletes are banned from the Davis Cup. International tennis took about 0.2 seconds to ban Russia. Yet then when it comes to Israel, whose crimes far outweigh for far longer Russia's crimes, it becomes sports is not political and it's extremist to demand this. So we see again that that is in fact a political ideology. It's just a political ideology that leans towards the interests of the imperial nations and against those of the people. What this demonstrates is that there still is that original fear of what sports can do to organize the working classes. So this is obviously less common in North America, but in Europe, you have entire football clubs that are explicitly left-wing. And so we've seen, while the elites have crushed political dissent on the street in protest, in academia, in law, in all of our institutions that has been dedicating to crushing civil rights, crushing free speech, as was said by the Celtic team, or Celtic, I don't know how you say it, in Ireland, the soccer team, the terraces remain one of the few places where working class political expression can still thrive. So even as they try to price out working class people from sports, even as they try to make it inaccessible, when the working classes are actually given the space, what we've seen in those terraces is people flying Palestinian flags despite them being banned, people wearing Palestinian jerseys, the big displays of images of, so they do those big, like everybody flashing cards for Palestine. And so we've seen these outbreaks, including at the World Cup when it was in Dubai. And there was constantly people running on the field with Palestine flags, and the Western media
Yeah.
was so invested in crushing that. So I say that to say that sports does remain, it's more sanitized in North America, but it does remain this terrain where the masses can respond and have their voices heard. And that's exactly why it matters to the elites. And that's exactly why on something like the Davis Cup, it's not just yielding on Israel. I think more broadly, they refuse to yield to the people, to the idea that sports should reflect the people's political priorities, because they believe it's an elitist private project that's about grift to build, their own stadiums, which is what they're talking about in Halifax, building a private stadium with developers that, season tickets for businesses. That's what they see sports as, its own little club, as opposed to a venue for self-expression of the body for working class people.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like John Horn, I think, is a critical sports writer, and he says like, what about sport are we willing to give up? Which is an interesting question. Like professional sport is this incredibly massive economy unto itself, and even the politicization of obviously racist team names is this huge struggle that requires, massive uprising to, so it's like really, unfortunately, like stagnated and stiff. But I think these moments, these focusing events like the Davis Cup allow us to sort of deconstruct it in a way. Like I was reading the coverage, for example, around all this public pressure here, resulting in the event not having spectators and all this stuff, right? A minor victory, but like a major one in some ways as well. And like what struck me about the coverage is just like this, of course, appeal to journalistic balance that CBC always likes to sort of, mime, where it's quoting like the ITF PR guy, right? The Tennis Federation PR guy, and all of the stuff he's saying is about what? The economic impact and the purity of sport. And those are the things I think that are meant to largely sanitize sport, like just take politics entirely out of it. Could you maybe like parse a little bit these
Yeah.
appeals to like safety and security, economic advantages of bringing sport in, and how that does seem to displace like all of these conversations we're having?
Well, the irony in this case is even like they only sold 1,400 to 1,500 tickets. So there was no appetite for this event anyway, and you can't really blame that on pro. So the people voted with their dollars, which is what I thought capitalism is supposed to be in the free market, and the people weren't interested. So Tennis Canada is using the specter of, relying on these quotes about extremism, extremists shutting this down. If there was actually crowds of people lining up to go, nothing would have shut it down. So what they're doing is actually covering their own incompetence. Once Felix pulled out, that was it. People aren't that. Can anybody name any of the tennis players left that are playing? So on the one hand, it's supposed to be this big international match. On the other hand, it's frankly a bunch of, nobody's familiar with these people. It's not like it's, Serena Williams versus Naomi Osaka or something, right? Like it's people that, unless you're a hardcore tennis fan, which is like probably the 1,500 people that bought tickets, the average people in the public are just not interested in this match. So they promised this huge economic benefit and all this tourism, which we know those calculations are always lies anyway. They always say that when they're building a stadium or trying to bring this or that sporting event, the Olympics, and they always cost money. And like the Olympics is a massive money drain. It doesn't bring in money. And this is true of all these major sporting events. They cost money to the taxpayers.
Public money.
Public money.
Yeah.
So, that's a myth to start with. The idea that it was ever going to bring in $2.2 million in tourism is absolutely ludicrous. And these claims are never tested. So then when there isn't a particular appetite in Halifax and, 2 weeks after, like in the last days of summer when people are trying to hopefully catch the last time to go out to the beach and stuff, like people aren't trying to go to this thing, then they blame it on, safety threats from protesters, which is something we've seen repeatedly from our institutions and needs to be named clearly as anti-Palestinian racism, right? The idea that any support for Palestinians is inherently violent and terroristic. And these narratives, you see how they're carried in both these subtle and unsubtle ways. So using your democratic right to protest in a country where we are not yet in apartheid state, right? Like we are not yet under checkpoints and military rule, but this is enacted upon us, that how dare we speak up in our own city to protest our own use of public money. And so Tennis Canada is effectively defending Israel and their right to shut us down under the claim that this is Canadian patriotism and Canadian values. So, it's very backwards. But as I pointed out in my remarks yesterday, it's actually very, very appropriate that this match should be played in silence because that's all that's left that supports. And, the elite officials will be there supporting and backslapping each other while the public is like not interested. And that's pretty much what's left of the defense of Israel now. The vast majority of the Canadian public comprehensively now believes Israel is committing genocide. The support is not with Israel. And the only reason why this support remains what it is because our elite and political and industrial and economic classes are all in. And so this match is such an example of how they try to force this stuff upon us. And then when there's legitimate and obvious pushback, they label you an extremist as if it's extreme. What I find absolutely mind-boggling is you have journalists whose colleagues are being murdered in Palestine, calling us extremists because we're the ones saying maybe you shouldn't invite the nation who's murdering those journalists. Israel has killed over 800 athletes, including children. They bomb stadiums and they prevent freedom of movement. They prevent Palestinians from playing sports. They ban bringing in sporting equipment. They target people and shoot for their legs. The number of athletes that Israel has murdered in what has been named athleticide. And then it's extreme to say, don't host the nation doing that, just as you don't host Russia, just as South Africa wasn't hosted, under the same values that you proclaim, which is international law, human rights. He's supposed to be the values of Canada. And remember that we are signatory to international treaties on genocide that say that if a country is committing genocide, we are not to support that. And that includes financial support. And the Davis Cup is clearly financial support for Israel.
Yeah, no, and what's interesting, I talked to Jonathan Liew of The Guardian earlier today, and he pointed out that this soft power strategy, this Hezbollah strategy that Israel is adopting, hasn't really worked largely when it comes to sport, right? It's fallen flat. And so, that doesn't stop them from trying because, as many people have pointed out, like the state of Israel is not just maintained through military power, right? There's this network, this kind of propaganda network that's meant to produce a kind of alternative reality, I think, where these things are just not happening. I mean, Lou writes in his article that you're supposed to look at these sporting events and forget, right? There's an intentional forgetting that's supposed to be induced by this like escapism that sport provides. But that soft power it's like there's nothing there, it
And
feels like. I think
Israel
you're right.
understands that because they run an outstanding athlete program by which athletes who are elite athletes on the world stage, including every single member of this tennis team, are given leave from the military while they're serving in order to compete in international matches and to train. So Israel clearly sees the importance. So what we have is a delegation made up of former and current IDF soldiers being given leave in some cases to come and play this match because that is important to Israel, and then telling us that we are the ones injecting politics. So what I find interesting again is the focus on danger from the protesters while you're bringing in current and former IDF soldiers. So shouldn't the RCMP perhaps be focused on vetting them? I don't know if everybody saw the story about Daniel Raab in The Guardian just a couple of days ago, where he admitted to sniping an entire family of Palestinians in the head and
Yeah.
murdering them. So this is the behavior that we're opposing, and maybe that should be investigated. So, I mean, it's again this complete upside down world that has been the case throughout, obviously, 76 years of this genocide. This isn't new. That consistently the violence is reversed onto those who oppose it, and those who perpetrate it name themselves as the victims of those who oppose it, right? But I mean, what I find interesting too is for these right-wing commentators, we're clearly more entertaining for free than the tennis because they didn't want to buy tickets. Like, the same people that are saying, oh, extremists shut this down, don't have tickets. They didn't want to go. They're far more interested in paying us attention. So maybe you should be giving me $200 US to entertain you with my protest because you're more interested in that than you were in watching the tennis.
Yeah, I mean that's a concern I have, honestly, is like we're so right now like under this like avalanche of just horrific images and stories that at a certain point I am concerned that there's either going to be a turning away or an actual numbing. I can't imagine that happening, but we are at a point where, as you say, like opposing genocide is still somehow controversial or risky when done in public. Like it's hard to remain legitimately public. And you have St. Mary's prof Neil Ballin saying that like it shouldn't be radical. You have Omar El Akkad arguing in his book, I forget exactly how he frames it. Basically, at some point, everyone will
Yeah.
be against.
One day when this is all over, everyone will have always been against this. Yeah.
This idea that liberalism is his argument is basically that liberalism makes solidarity with Palestine too radical. It's actually liberalism that does it. And he's like awaiting some post-political moment, I guess, where grief can be expressed. But right now, I have to wonder if what we really need is in fact more anger. Because like nobody wants to talk. The people who are directly affected by decisions around the sporting event don't seem to actually want to weigh in. How do you make it possible for people to take a position like, hey, maybe children shouldn't be murdered en masse, right? And make that legitimately a statement people can make in public and in or within organizations.
There's a Palestinian principle of sumud. So I went to the West Bank, as you know, I went to Palestine. So I was very blessed and lucky to spend, a few weeks learning at the feet of Palestinian organizers and activists. And the principle they're driven by is sumud, which is the principle of steadfastness. So it's remaining strong in your faith, remaining strong on your land, remaining strong in your beliefs and in your own values in the face of genocide. So that's staying on the land, though they try to force you off. But it's also maintaining your own faith and values. And I think that's an important principle. So anger can be part of it, but I also think it's steadfastness, right? That, it doesn't, I've done enough in my life. It doesn't, I mean, it bothers me on an intellectual level. I cannot understand how a journalist can watch 238 of their colleagues being murdered and then write about extremism on the behalf of protesters who shut this match down. Like that doesn't compute to me. I don't understand. I just want to say, are you okay? Like what's wrong with you? But at the same time, it's not new to me and it's not going to shake me. And I actually see it again as a dying gasp as an ideology that cannot survive other than through what has been a mass silencing. The attitude has always been make it impossible to say anything about Palestine. So there's this pretense like there might be something you can say for Palestine, but not this, not this, not this. Like literally nothing you actually would do or say is acceptable. So you cannot buy into this. It's if we were protesting, if you just say free Palestine, you're extremist. If you said I don't like this tennis match, it's extremist. If you go and hold a Palestinian flag, it's extremist. If you hold, so it is the unspeakable. So the only thing we can do is, I think, be steadfast in our resolve, and that includes things like showing up to protest in the face of people insulting you and smearing you. Your own Tennis Canada, in defense of Israel, smearing Canadians and then calling that patriotism. And then suggesting we're the ones that aren't patriots, but we're the ones that are actually standing up for the so-called Canadian values, such as international law and human rights, which is supposedly the very values we're supposed to be defending. And you're the ones not defending those values in order to run cover for a genocidal regime and then insulting the people in their own city and calling that pro-Canadian. So, we just can't, I think, bow to that. So to me, I feel secure in our decisions, I think, and I feel secure in the way that we speak out. Unlike, people who live in Israel that live their whole lives and don't interact with Palestinians on any substantial level, and unlike certainly the members of Tennis Canada who name themselves as friends of Israel but do nothing to say support tennis in Palestine, I do speak and organize and work with Palestinians, including Palestinians here and in Palestine. So I think when you are grounded in that foundation of what justice feels, looks like, what it is on a daily basis, what it means to struggle for it, when you know people on the ground who have been killed by settlers in the West Bank after you spoke to them, I just don't think that this is a high mountain to climb in that sense. So I think we can't allow ourselves to be distracted. I think we know what's right. This is symbolic grounds, like sports is symbolic, but it is, if it weren't important, if these symbols weren't important, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to preserve them. So they always, when we protest, it always becomes, why are you making such a big deal? It's just sports. But if it's just sports, it wouldn't be anything to shut it down. So the idea that every conservative commentator now has to come out and parrot the same talking points about extremism shows exactly how much this does matter. And that's exactly why we fight on these grounds. So, I think, again, like, Israel understands the importance. That's why they are sending out these teams. And we've seen in the Vuelta in Spain, we saw how the public comprehensively shut that down. We've seen now the Italian football coaches have come out and called to Israel to be removed. It is growing. Athletes are beginning to speak out. And how could you not, when your fellow athletes are being maimed, murdered, tortured, abducted? I don't want to live in a world, which unfortunately we live in right now, where the victims of violence are the bad ones, and like saying don't kill children is somehow a hateful statement and killing children is considered moral. That is backwards. And the only thing we can do to right that is, I think, put our bodies in the street, put our mouths, our voices out there, and let it fall where it may, I guess, in that sense. But I feel, like I said, I feel secure in our actions to oppose this, and we have been successful. A partial victory, but to force this match to be played in the same shameful silence that marks Tennis Canada's, they've never once expressed any empathy for Palestinians. They have never once expressed, like, yes, they oppose, they condemn war crimes. They've remained completely silent on Palestine. So to play this match in silence, I think, marks exactly what they deserve, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a fitting punishment for their cowardice in some sense. And like the way that Lou put it in our conversation earlier is that because Israel has not actually really thrived in terms of trying to engineer this propaganda machine in the form of like sports success, organizations like Tennis Canada haven't had to face these questions, right? And in the Mondoweiss article, written by a group of folks on this struggle, they pointed out that they have no doubt officials with Tennis Canada were dismayed to see their teams draw, knowing it would put them in this difficult position. But the level of passivity and complicity that it takes to just sort of wait for this inconvenient decision to be made rather than be proactive in some way.
Well, I think that's why they chose Halifax. I think they underestimated Halifax. They knew they couldn't pull this off in Toronto and Montreal, right? So I've been connecting it. I don't think it's disconnected from the Halifax International Security Forum, right? We hold the security forum every year. And I once was sitting at a table because I was at a separate event during the International Security Forum, and I was at the table with the politicians, and they were bragging about how all the Americans, like, it's so amazing that we can just come to Halifax and walk around, and we don't even need security because so this is, I think, part of the guarantees they made is like, look, we host the security forum, we've hosted the defense minister of Israel, they've hosted like the Israeli prime minister, they host all these people. John McCain was here, Condoleezza Rice was here during the Iraq war, and So I think they made these guarantees. It's, Halifax is this small, sleepy town. They can't muster more than a couple of hundred people. Like, they wouldn't dare try this in Toronto or Montreal. So I think they underestimated, frankly, the public and the public pushback and what the actual political feeling is about Israel from ordinary people. So I think it was a deliberate move to place it here. They were counting on, yeah, like the military history of the city, the relatively conservative population in a lot of places, and what they thought was a known quantity of activists. And I think they've been proven wrong. So I actually think in many ways they were caught flat-footed by the strength of the response and the effectiveness of the response, which is why they've pivoted to, like I said, this shameful, blaming and name calling rather than taking accountability for their own poor planning, their own inability to promote this event, and like frankly, their own incompetence.
Yeah, 100%. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, like why Halifax? But let's talk about it. Maybe this we could end with this question. One of the activists who organized a number of these protests and has been organizing for Palestine is Yara Jamal, um, Free Palestine Halifax organizer. She wrote earlier in the year that Halifax is a port city that is helping to facilitate this genocide, right? She says in 2024, Canada's military exports to Israel hit a record $30.6 million. The breach has shown that the Canadian federal government is basically lying about this. Halifax, in Jamal's words, is, quote, the first inbound and last outbound port of call on the continent, right? So I guess my question is like, they underestimated us. What would it mean to actually kind of shut down this node of corporate militarism, for the struggle for Palestinian liberation? Should we think of ourselves in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we stepped into this moment. Again, I don't think Halifax was prepared. There's been a growing movement, particularly around sports in the last really few weeks. It's always been, obviously, Palestinians have always been calling for boycotting of Israel in international sport, but that movement has been growing. Like, as I said, we just saw the Vuelta, which had to move the finishing line multiple times because of the strength of protests as they went through Spain. We know the protest is growing in sports, so they happen to hit a time where not only is Israel's crimes becoming more and more visible to the public, where public opinion has substantially shifted, but there's also specifically been more and more attention to this area of sports, and they stumbled into that. But we're very clear that this is only one of our battles. And yeah, there is Labor for Palestine has been running a campaign about hot cargo, which is the unions can refuse to handle hot cargo, which would be anything designated for Israel that helps them maintain their blockade, apartheid, and genocide of Palestinians. And so obviously the real fight is that economic fight. It's being held at the Scotiabank Arena, or was supposed to be held. They had to move it, but it was to be held at the Scotiabank Arena. Scotiabank has been the focus of a number of protests, including within the literary world, because of their investment in Elbit Systems, which is the largest weapons manufacturer in Israel. And there's been successful fights to both remove Scotiabank funding from the arts and to push Scotiabank to divest from Elbit. So, these are the real things. So this is an economic battle as well, because like I said, they were citing tourism, hotels, all these things. And so we know we cost them money. We know that this decision is costly to them, and they were counting on this tourism. But obviously the much bigger goal would be that Israel has to be politically, economically, socially, etc., isolated, just like South Africa was. A society caught up in genocidal mania does not and cannot stop on its own. You're long past the point of the term where a society can somehow pull back, and pull back to what? The status quo in Israel has never been justice, but certainly at this point, the public statements of the members of government that have been well documented at the ICJ. The head of the Israeli tennis that they interviewed said, we have nothing to be sorry for. We are defending ourselves. That is an extremist point of view. Not even many sad things have happened. Just not, we're good. Like, that is extreme and was what passes for normal within this discourse. So this is certainly just a vehicle. It's a mobilization spot. I think it placed us within a global conversation, but it's not a stopping point. So again, we continue to march forward and we have to be undeterred. So the real goal is things like this economic activity, diplomatic relations, the weapons sales to Israel. And until our countries do more than just shake their fingers every few months and go, we condemn this strongly. If you keep doing this, how many times have we seen that statement? Yet no actual action taken for an arms embargo, no, not withdrawing of ambassadors, not breaking diplomatic ties, nothing. So, I mean, it's not unexpected, but as usual, a sad spectacle that it's the people in the streets that are willing to risk things and put up their time and organization, and that energy is what actually forced this kind of change, whereas our government can't even get them to stop killing our own citizens when they go there. So
yeah. Okay. Right now, it's great to hear you speak to these issues with such like ferocious, clarity, right? Like that moral clarity of like these are the sites of struggle that we need to be addressing, and also like we're being lied to. Like the people in power are perpetually lying about how deeply connected they are, right, to this like rogue fascist state.
Tennis Canada, the head has gone on multiple delegations to Israel. They brought in Israeli youth after October 7th. They have multiple ties. In fact, international tennis is very tied to Bill Ackman, the billionaire who famously tried to defund Harvard and threatened Harvard. Apparently I've heard he funds the International Tennis Players Union. So their tennis association, the Players Association. There was a famous debacle with him a few months ago where he basically paid the money so he could play in a doubles match and then got super embarrassed, and people like Andy Roddick were like, this is embarrassing, and then the Hall of Fame had to turn down his $10 million donation. So tennis is an elite sport. So it's no surprise that tennis of all sports would be a site where there's this massive support for imperial settler colonialism and military. This is a sport that's still struggling with the involvement of Black people. This is a sport played in country clubs. This is a sport that has that heritage. So are we surprised that of all sports, tennis, the elitist sport, would of course be one that's going to, with tooth and nail, fight to defend Israel? Of course, because Israel is a project of the elites. So none of this surprises me. But the idea that we're supposed to divorce, again, tennis of all people telling us tennis isn't political, while they enforce you have to wear dress whites and the strawberries of Wimbledon and the civility of the match. So of course they always claim that what they do isn't political and what we do is. But again, sports is inherently political. We already had this conversation with South Africa. So the idea that we have to keep pretending that we're ignorant of this conversation, this has happened already, and they knew it when they banned Russia.
So frustrating.
So
yeah, that's the most frustrating part. I've heard your friend Desmond Cole talk about this on mainstream news. I am just refusing, basically, to start from scratch in this conversation, starting instead from just the demand, Anyway, thanks so much, Elle. I know you have other things.
No, and I think I want to end just by saying that
please.
we also had speakers at our press conference yesterday who have family trapped in Gaza. One has lost over 60 family members. Another one's mother, Tarek's family, he's lost over 60 family members. Najia's mother is trapped in Gaza. Canada has refused to bring them in while rolling up the red carpet to bring in the Israeli tennis players. So this is a human thing. So whatever people want to say about what they think our motives are, there are real human beings, people whose family is trapped in Gaza that Canada has refused to bring out while they brought over, 300,000 Ukrainians, and they brought out 1,000 people from Gaza while our own weapons and our own government runs cover them. So if you cannot see exactly why that is so shameful and anti-humane, that members who have served in the IDF are given this red carpet and we're not allowed to protest them, and then the people that are victims of their bombing and starvation that have family in Canada are not allowed out. So that's why we march, and I'm never going to let anybody distract us from that, make us think that we're doing something wrong, or make us think that we're somehow the violent ones. The extremism is that, and humanity and basic compassion and basic, frankly, common sense and having eyes is on our side. And I'm long past the point where I'm going to apologize for having eyes,